An innocent young girl marries to an ignorant rich old man. The truth she uncovers will leave you speechless. Eleanor Peter stood before the gilded mirror in her childhood bedroom, tears silently tracking down her cheeks as her mother fastened the last pearl button on her wedding gown. The ivory silk felt like a straitjacket against her dark skin, beautiful, expensive, and suffocating. "Stop crying, child," Margaret Peter chided, her weathered hands smoothing the dress's train. "You know this is for the best. Do you think I worked 3 jobs cleaning white folks' houses just for you to stay poor?" Her mother's voice carried the weight of decades of hardship, each word another brick in the wall of obligation that surrounded Eleanor. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind she never asked for. Stephen Davies had walked into the accounting firm where she worked, his silver hair immaculate and his wallet thick enough to buy the building twice over. He'd taken an interest in her immediately, not in the way young men did, with their clumsy compliments and transparent desires, but with the calculated precision of a man accustomed to acquiring valuable assets. Eleanor remembered the dinner, where it all changed. Stephen had invited her whole family to the city's most exclusive restaurant, the kind where the menus didn't list prices and the waiters looked down their noses at black patrons, no matter how well dressed. He'd ordered champagne that cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent and smiled at Margaret with practiced charm. "Your daughter," he'd said, swirling his crystal glass, "is a rare jewel in today's world. Such grace, such intelligence." His pale blue eyes had flickered to Eleanor's face, not with love, but with satisfaction. "I would be honored to provide her, and by extension your entire family, with the life you all deserve." It wasn't a proposal so much as a business transaction, and Margaret had seized it like a lifeline. The following weeks were a blur of Eleanor's protests, dying under her mother's relentless pressure. "Think of your sisters," Margaret would say. "With Stephen's connections, Marie can get into that private school she dreams about. Sarah's medical bills for her asthma. Gone. Your father's retirement. Secured." Each argument was another weight on Eleanor's shoulders, another reminder of the responsibilities that came with being the eldest daughter in a struggling family. Her father remained silent, his eyes heavy with unspoken apologies whenever he looked at her. But he didn't intervene, couldn't intervene, against the force of Margaret's determination to see her daughter saved from their working-class life. The engagement party had been a society affair, with Eleanor feeling like an exotic exhibit at a museum. Stephen's friends, all old money and older prejudices, had circled her like vultures, their compliments thinly veiling their scrutiny. "How progressive of Stephen," they'd whispered behind crystal flutes, taking a chance on someone so different. Now, standing in her childhood bedroom on her wedding day, Eleanor watched her reflection and barely recognized herself. The elegant updo, the designer gown, the diamond necklace Stephen had sent over that morning, they were all pieces of a costume she never auditioned to wear. "Mama," she whispered, one last attempt at escape, "I don't love him." Margaret's hands stilled on the train. For a moment something like pain flickered across her face in the mirror. Then it hardened into the same determination that had carried her through decades of struggling to keep her family afloat. "Love is a luxury, Eleanor. Security is a necessity. One day you'll thank me for this." A knock at the door announced the arrival of the wedding planner, clipboard in hand, and anxiety written across her face. "The guests are seated, and Mr. Davies is waiting. It's time." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the last pieces of her old life fall away. She thought of her small apartment, her independence, her dreams of earning her CPA license and starting her own firm. All of it now seemed as distant as the stars. "Remember to smile," Margaret instructed, adjusting Eleanor's veil one final time. "This is the happiest day of your life." Eleanor wanted to laugh at the irony, but she feared if she started, she might never stop. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and did what generations of women in her family had done before her. She sacrificed her dreams on the altar of practical necessity. The wedding march began to play downstairs, its notes floating up like a funeral dirge disguised as celebration. Eleanor took her father's arm, feeling him trembling slightly against her. "You don't have to do this, baby girl," he whispered so quietly she almost missed it. But they both knew that wasn't true. The contracts were signed, the guests were seated, and her family's future hung in the balance. Eleanor Peter took her first step toward becoming Mrs. Davies, each step down the stairs, feeling like another nail in the coffin of her freedom. At the bottom, she caught a glimpse of Stephen waiting at the makeshift altar in their garden. He stood tall and proud, every inch the successful businessman, a small smile playing at his lips as he watched his investment approach. The sun caught his silver hair like a crown, and Eleanor realized that's what this was. Not a marriage, but a coronation, with her as the unwilling queen of his carefully constructed kingdom. The guests rose as she emerged into the garden, their faces a blur of polite smiles and curious stares. Eleanor felt her mother's eyes boring into her back, heard the whispered prayers of gratitude from her sisters, and understood with crystal clarity that love had nothing to do with what was about to happen. This was survival, dressed up in white silk and orange blossoms. This was duty, masked as romance. This was her cage, disguised as salvation. And as Eleanor Peter took the final steps toward Stephen Davies and her new life, she made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to make this sacrifice mean something. If she had to live in a gilded cage, she would at least learn to sing. When money drowns, the soul's last whisper. The first month of marriage to Stephen Davies was like drowning in honey, sweet on the surface, but suffocating underneath. Eleanor found herself transported from her modest world into a realm of opulence that felt more like a museum than a home. The Davies mansion, with its 23 rooms and century-old legacy, loomed over her like a beautiful prison. Stephen wasted no time in improving his new wife. A parade of consultants marched through their home. Etiquette coaches, fashion advisors, speech therapists, eager to soften her slight Boston accent. Each one came with a smile and left with a hefty check, having chipped away another piece of Eleanor's identity. "Darling," Stephen would say, his voice dripping with condescending affection, "you represent the Davies name now. We must ensure you do it justice." His pale hand would rest on her shoulder, heavy as a shackle, while he scrutinized her transformation like an artist refining his masterpiece. The weekly society luncheons became Eleanor's personal battlefield. Ladies who lunched with their perfectly coiffed hair and generations of privilege would smile with teeth like daggers. "Eleanor, dear," they'd say, "how brave of you to wear such vibrant colors." Or, "It must be quite an adjustment coming from your background." Mrs. Constance Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of their social circle, was particularly skilled at wielding words like weapons. "Stephen has always had such unique tastes," she'd observed during one particularly painful afternoon tea. "Though I must say, you're handling the transition better than we expected. Some people might have found it overwhelming, suddenly having to manage such a substantial household." Eleanor had smiled through gritted teeth, remembering how she'd graduated top of her class in accounting, how she'd managed entire corporate portfolios. But here, in this world of old money and older prejudices, her intelligence was dismissed as readily as her heritage. At night, lying beside Stephen in their massive four-poster bed, Eleanor would stare at the ceiling and count her blessings, the ones her mother insisted she should be grateful for. Her family was taken care of now. Marie had started at the prestigious private school she'd dreamed of. Sarah's asthma treatments were no longer a source of constant worry. Her father had finally been able to retire from the construction job that was slowly breaking his body. But the price of their comfort was her freedom, and it grew steeper with each passing day. Stephen's controlling nature revealed itself in subtle ways at first. He hired a new driver, insisting it wasn't safe for Eleanor to drive herself. He replaced her phone with one that had better security features and, she discovered, tracking software. He even assigned one of the maids to act as her lady's companion, though they both knew Margaret was there to report on Eleanor's every move. The breaking point came during a dinner party Stephen hosted for his business associates. Eleanor had spent weeks preparing, determined to prove she could be the perfect hostess. She'd selected the menu, arranged the flowers, memorized details about each guest to ensure engaging conversation. The evening had gone smoothly until Mr. Henderson, one of Stephen's oldest clients, made a comment about urban elements ruining the neighborhood's character. Eleanor, unable to bite her tongue, had responded with a carefully worded but pointed observation about systemic inequality in housing development. The silence that followed was deafening. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Stephen's mask of benevolent benefactor cracked. "Do you have any idea," he hissed, pacing their bedroom, "how long I've cultivated that relationship? Henderson manages half the real estate portfolios in New England." "He was being racist," Eleanor said quietly, standing her ground. "You expect me to just smile and nod?" Stephen's laugh was cold. "I expect you to remember your place. Do you think I married you so you could play social justice warrior at my dinner parties? I married you because you were different, quiet, respectful, grateful for the opportunity I was offering." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. The opportunity to be your puppet, your token trophy wife. His face hardened. The opportunity to elevate yourself and your family above the circumstances of your birth. Or have you forgotten where you came from, how easily all this could disappear? The threat was clear, and it carried the weight of not just her future, but her entire family's. Eleanor felt the last illusion of equality in their marriage shatter like fine china on marble floors. That night, after Stephen had fallen asleep, Eleanor stood at their bedroom window, looking out over the manicured gardens that stretched into darkness. The moon cast everything in silver, making the familiar landscape seem alien and hostile. She thought of her old apartment, tiny but filled with her books, her dreams, her independence. A movement caught her eye, the new gardener, working late to prepare the roses for an upcoming garden party. He looked up, catching her gaze, and offered a small wave. Eleanor found herself waving back before she could think better of it. In that simple, human gesture, she felt something stir in her chest, something that had been dormant since her wedding day. It wasn't hope, not quite, but it was a reminder that somewhere, beneath the designer clothes and careful manners, the real Eleanor Peter still existed. She turned away from the window, her reflection in the darkened glass overlaying the garden scene like a double exposure. The perfect Mrs. Davies and the struggling soul of Eleanor Peter, trapped in the same frame but worlds apart. That night she dreamed of flying, of breaking free from golden chains. But when she woke, the weight of her reality settled back onto her shoulders like a familiar burden. She had made her choice, or rather, had it made for her. Now she had to live with the consequences, one suffocating day at a time. The question was, how long could she continue to sacrifice her dignity on the altar of family obligation? And when the breaking point finally came, would there be anything left of Eleanor Peter to save? A diamond ring that became her prison. 3 months into her marriage, Eleanor discovered that wealth was its own kind of poverty. The Davies mansion, despite its grandeur, had become a gilded cage where her every move was monitored, every word scrutinized, and every attempt at independence quietly but firmly suppressed. The morning everything began to change started like any other. Eleanor sat at her vanity, methodically applying the expensive makeup Stephen insisted she wear, when her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Marie. "They're kicking me out of school." Eleanor's hands froze. The prestigious private school had been one of Stephen's primary bargaining chips in persuading her family to support the marriage. She immediately called Marie, her heart pounding. "There was an incident," Marie sobbed. "Jessica Whitmore, you know, Mrs. Whitmore's daughter. She said some terrible things about you and Stephen, about our family. I lost my temper." Eleanor closed her eyes, already seeing the dominoes falling. Of course it would be Constance Whitmore's daughter. The woman had been waiting for an opportunity like this since Eleanor married into their social circle. "Mr. Davies," Margaret, the maid-turned-spy, knocked on her door. "He's requesting your presence in his study immediately." Eleanor found Stephen behind his massive mahogany desk, looking every bit the disapproving patriarch. Mrs. Whitmore sat across from him, her perfectly arranged features set in an expression of righteous indignation. "Eleanor, darling." Stephen's voice carried that dangerous softness she'd come to fear. "Constance here was just telling me about an unfortunate situation involving your sister." "My Jessica is traumatized," Mrs. Whitmore interjected, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "To be physically threatened by that girl." "Marie didn't threaten anyone," Eleanor said quietly but firmly. "She defended her family against racist insults." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Stephen's fingers drummed against his desk, a warning sign Eleanor had learned to recognize. "Nevertheless," he said, "we need to handle this diplomatically. Constance has graciously agreed not to press charges if Marie withdraws from the school voluntarily." "Press charges?" Eleanor's voice rose. "For what?" Standing up. "To a bully? Eleanor?" Stephen's tone could have frozen fire. "This is not up for discussion. Your sister's behavior reflects poorly on all of us. I've already spoken with your mother." Of course he had. Eleanor felt the walls closing in. Her mother would be frantic about losing Stephen's support, about returning to their life of constant financial struggle. The weight of their dependence on Stephen's goodwill pressed down on her like a physical force. "Now," Stephen continued, his voice softening to that patronizing tone she despised, "why don't you and Constance go have lunch? Show her there are no hard feelings between our families." It wasn't a suggestion. Eleanor recognized the command beneath the polite veneer. She was expected to apologize, to smooth things over, to once again sacrifice her dignity for the sake of peace. The lunch was torture. Mrs. Whitmore spent 2 hours subtly insulting Eleanor's background while reminiscing about Stephen's first wife, a real lady from their social circle who had tragically passed away 5 years ago. When Eleanor finally returned home, she found Stephen waiting in their bedroom. "I've arranged for Marie to attend a boarding school in Switzerland," he announced without preamble. "She leaves next week." Switzerland? Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure cracking. "You can't just ship my sister off to another continent." "I can, and I will." Stephen's mask slipped, revealing the steel beneath. "Your family's continued comfort depends entirely on your cooperation, Eleanor. Or have you forgotten our arrangement?" "Our arrangement?" Eleanor laughed, a harsh sound that surprised them both. "You mean your purchase? Because that's what this is, isn't it? You bought yourself a young, exotic wife, and now you're upset that she and her family aren't performing exactly as expected." The slap wasn't hard, but it shocked them both into silence. Stephen had never raised a hand to her before. His face showed a flicker of regret before hardening again. "You will get yourself under control," he said quietly. "You will call your sister and convince her that Switzerland is an amazing opportunity. You will apologize to Constance Whitmore, and you will never, ever speak to me like that again. Are we clear?" Eleanor touched her cheek, feeling something inside her shift irreversibly. In that moment, she saw her future stretching out before her, years of submission, of swallowing her pride, of watching her family dance to Stephen's tune. Years of slowly disappearing until Eleanor Peter ceased to exist, leaving only Mrs. Davies, the perfect society wife, in her place. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor slipped out to the garden. The roses were in full bloom, their perfume heavy in the warm air. James, the gardener, was working late again, his strong hands gentle with the delicate blooms. "Rough day, Mrs. Davies?" he asked, his eyes full of genuine concern rather than judgment. Eleanor touched her cheek, where expensive makeup concealed the faint mark of Stephen's hand. "Just thinking about choices," she said softly, "and consequences." James nodded, offering her a perfect white rose. "Sometimes the most expensive chains are the ones we forge ourselves," he said, his fingers brushing hers as she took the flower. That simple touch, warm and human and freely given, sent electricity through Eleanor's body. She looked into James's eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in months, recognition. Not of Mrs. Davies, Stephen's carefully crafted society wife, but of Eleanor Peter, the woman who had dreamed of building her own life before duty and family obligation intervened. Standing there in the moonlit garden, Eleanor made a decision. She wouldn't disappear. She wouldn't let Stephen erase who she was. She would find a way to break free, not just for herself, but for Marie, for her family, for the woman she had been and the woman she still wanted to become. The white rose in her hand suddenly seemed less like a flower and more like a promise of hope, of change, of possibility. Eleanor didn't know yet how she would manage it, but she knew with absolute certainty that her life had to change. The question was, would she have the courage to face the consequences of breaking free? Mansion walls hide the most dangerous desires. The incident with Marie marked a turning point in Eleanor's marriage. Stephen's true nature had been revealed, not just to Eleanor, but to the household staff who whispered in corners and cast sympathetic glances her way. The mansion's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tensions, like the air before a storm. Eleanor found herself drawn more frequently to the gardens, the only place she felt she could breathe freely. James was always there, tending to the roses with a devotion that matched her own need for escape. Their conversations, initially casual, grew deeper with each passing day. "Tell me about your dreams," James asked one evening, as they sat on a hidden bench behind the rose trellises. The setting sun painted everything in gold, making the moment feel somehow separate from reality. "The ones you had before all this." Eleanor closed her eyes, allowing herself to remember. "I wanted to start my own accounting firm," she said softly, "specifically focusing on helping small minority-owned businesses navigate financial challenges. I was 3 courses away from my CPA certification when you married him," James finished, his voice careful but not judgmental. "When I sold my soul," Eleanor corrected, opening her eyes to find James watching her intently. The understanding in his gaze made her heart flutter dangerously. "Your soul isn't for sale, Eleanor," he said quietly, "no matter what he thinks he bought." It was the first time he'd used her first name, and it felt intimate in a way that made her breath catch. She knew she should leave, should maintain the proper distance between herself and an employee. But something kept her rooted to that bench, craving the simple humanity of their connection. Their meetings became more frequent, though they maintained a careful facade of professionalism whenever others were present. James would work late, knowing Eleanor often walked in the gardens after Stephen retired to his study with his nightly bourbon. They talked about everything, their families, their hopes, the books they loved. Eleanor learned that James had put himself through agricultural college, that he specialized in sustainable garden design, that he worked for Stephen only to gain experience with heritage roses before starting his own landscaping business. His passion for his work, his unwillingness to be defined by his circumstances, stirred something in Eleanor that she'd thought long buried. One particularly difficult evening, after Stephen had berated her at dinner for talking too much to his business associates, Eleanor fled to the gardens in tears. James found her by the fountain, her expensive dress soaked from the mist. "He's wrong," James said simply, draping his work jacket over her shoulders. "Your intelligence isn't a flaw to be hidden. Your compassion isn't a weakness to be corrected." Eleanor looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Then why does it feel like I'm dying inside, like every day in this marriage kills another piece of who I am?" James reached out, hesitated, then gently wiped a tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, sending shivers through her body. "Because you're trying to live in a cage," he said softly, "and you were meant to fly." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Eleanor could feel her heart pounding, could see the same longing she felt reflected in James's eyes. It would be so easy to lean forward, to close the distance. "Mrs. Davies." Margaret's voice shattered the moment. "Mr. Davies is asking for you." Eleanor stepped back quickly, shrugging off James's jacket. "Thank you for your concern," she said formally, loud enough for Margaret to hear. "The roses are coming along beautifully." But that night marked another shift. Eleanor could no longer pretend that what she felt for James was simple friendship. Every glance, every accidental touch, every shared moment carried the weight of something deeper, more dangerous. Stephen, perhaps sensing the change in her, became more possessive. He hired additional security cameras for the grounds, claiming concerns about garden thieves. He began insisting Eleanor join him in his study during the evenings, watching her like a hawk as she pretended to read while he worked. "The gardens are looking particularly fine," he commented one night, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. "That new gardener certainly knows his work." Eleanor kept her face carefully neutral. "The roses are quite beautiful this year." "Indeed." Stephen swirled his bourbon thoughtfully. "Though I've noticed he tends to work rather late. Perhaps we should adjust his hours." The threat was clear, and Eleanor felt fear curl in her stomach, not for herself but for James. Stephen's revenge against perceived threats was always swift and merciless. That night, Eleanor lay awake in bed, listening to Stephen's steady breathing beside her. She thought about James, about the way he saw her, not as an acquisition or a project, but as a person worthy of respect and understanding. She thought about the dreams she'd abandoned, the woman she'd stopped being, the life she'd traded for her family's security. The moonlight streaming through the windows reminded her of that first night she'd seen James in the garden. Back then, he'd represented a simple human connection in her increasingly isolated world. Now he represented something far more dangerous, hope. Hope for a different life, for real love, for the chance to be herself again. But hope, Eleanor was learning, was the most dangerous emotion of all. Hope made people take risks, make mistakes, reach for things they couldn't have, and in her gilded cage, with Stephen's power over her family hanging like a sword above her head, hope could destroy everything. The question wasn't whether she loved James. In her heart, she already knew the answer. The question was whether she would let that love lead her family back into the poverty they'd escaped, whether she would risk everything for a chance at happiness. As dawn began to paint the sky, Eleanor made her decision. She wouldn't let Stephen destroy another person she cared about. Tomorrow, she would tell James they had to stop meeting, had to maintain proper boundaries. She would lock away her heart, bury her feelings, protect him the only way she could. But even as she resolved to do the right thing, Eleanor knew it was already too late. Her heart had already escaped its cage, and no amount of guilt or duty could lock it away again. The game had become infinitely more dangerous, and Eleanor knew that sooner or later something would have to break. The young gardener's love burns everything to ash. Eleanor's resolution to distance herself from James lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, a letter arrived that shattered her carefully constructed walls of restraint. The envelope was expensive, cream-colored stationery with the Whitmore family crest. Inside, Eleanor found an invitation to a garden charity gala, along with a handwritten note from Constance Whitmore that made her blood boil. "Stephen insisted we include you, dear. Do try to dress appropriately. We're showcasing heritage roses, not urban flora." With trembling hands, Eleanor fled to the garden, her safe haven. James was there, as she knew he would be, pruning the very roses Mrs. Whitmore had referenced. One look at Eleanor's face, and he set down his tools. "What happened?" he asked, leading her to their hidden bench behind the trellises. The words poured out of her, not just about the invitation, but everything. The constant belittling, the thinly veiled racism, Stephen's increasing control, her family's unwitting complicity in her imprisonment. As she spoke, James's expression darkened. "You deserve so much more than this," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You deserve to be loved, not owned, cherished, not displayed. You deserve—" He stopped, catching himself, but Eleanor's heart was already racing. "What do I deserve, James?" Their eyes met, and the electricity that had been building between them for months crackled in the air. James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with calloused fingers that were infinitely gentle. "You deserve to be loved by someone who sees you," he whispered. "Really sees you. Not the society wife Stephen created, not the dutiful daughter your mother wanted, but you, Eleanor Peter, with all your dreams and strength and fire." Eleanor leaned into his touch, knowing she was crossing a line but unable to stop herself. "And do you see me, James?" Instead of answering, he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and questioning, but it shook Eleanor to her core. This wasn't the possessive way Stephen kissed her, like marking his territory. This was an invitation, a question, a promise. When they broke apart, Eleanor was crying. "We can't," she whispered, even as her hand clutched his shirt. "Stephen would destroy you. He'd make sure you never worked in this industry again, and my family." "Run away with me," James said suddenly, his eyes intense. "I've been offered a position managing a heritage garden in California. It's a fresh start, Eleanor. We could build a life there, a real life. You could finish your CPA, start your firm, be free." The possibility of freedom was dizzying. "But my family—" "They survived before Stephen," James pointed out gently. "They can survive again, and once you're established, you can help them, the right way, not through guilt and obligation." Eleanor closed her eyes, imagining it. A life without Stephen's constant criticism, without society's judgment, without the suffocating weight of her gilded cage. A life with James, with love freely given and received, with the chance to rebuild herself. A twig snapped nearby, making them jump apart. Margaret stood at the garden path, her face pale. "Mrs. Davies," she said formally, "your husband is asking for you." Eleanor's heart stopped. Margaret had always been Stephen's spy. How much had she seen? But when she looked closer, she saw something unexpected in the maid's eyes. Sympathy. Mr. Davies is in his study, Margaret continued, then added quietly, he'll be occupied with phone calls for at least an hour. The meaning was clear. She was giving them time. Eleanor nodded gratefully, then turned back to James once Margaret had gone. I need time, she said, to think, to plan. If we do this, we have to do it right. I won't let Stephen hurt you. James caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. I'll wait. But Eleanor, don't wait too long. Every day in this place dims your light a little more, and I can't bear to watch you disappear. That night, Eleanor sat at her vanity, looking at her reflection. She barely recognized herself anymore. The designer clothes, the perfect makeup, the careful posture. But underneath it all, she could feel something awakening, something that had been dormant since her wedding day. Hope was dangerous, she knew. Love even more so. But as she touched her lips, still tingling from James's kiss, she realized some things were worth the risk. The question wasn't whether she would leave. She knew now that she had to, not just for James, but for herself. The question was how to do it without leaving behind a trail of destruction that would harm everyone she loved. As if reading her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a text from James. Some roses need to be pruned so others can bloom. You taught me that. Eleanor smiled, her first genuine smile in months. Yes, some things had to be cut away for new growth to flourish. She had been Stephen's carefully tended hothouse flower for too long. It was time to remember she was born to grow wild and free. The garden charity gala was in 2 weeks. It would be the perfect opportunity. Everyone would be there, all of Stephen's society friends, all the witnesses he could marshal against her. Let them see her choice. Let them watch as she finally broke free of her cage. Eleanor began to plan, her mind racing with possibilities. She had 2 weeks to arrange her escape, to ensure her family's security, to prepare for the scandal that would surely follow. 2 weeks to gather her courage and reclaim her life. As she got ready for bed, she caught Stephen watching her with suspicious eyes. You seem different tonight, he observed, almost happy. Eleanor met his gaze in the mirror, keeping her face carefully neutral. Just looking forward to the garden gala, she said smoothly. After all, Mrs. Whitmore did say to dress appropriately. She would dress appropriately indeed for her last appearance as Mrs. Davies and her first step back to being Eleanor Peter. A love letter written in blood and betrayal. The 2 weeks leading up to the garden gala became an intricate dance of deception. Eleanor moved through the mansion like a ghost, playing the perfect wife while secretly laying the groundwork for her escape. Each day was a careful balance of maintaining appearances while putting her plan into motion. Late at night, when Stephen was deep in his bourbon-induced sleep, Eleanor would carefully transfer small amounts from her household account to a new secret account she had created. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to give her a foundation for her new life. Her accounting skills, so long dismissed by Stephen's social circle, now became her greatest weapon. James had become her silent partner in this dangerous game. Their meetings were brief, careful, always under the pretense of discussing the garden preparations for the gala. But in those stolen moments, they finalized their plans, each detail meticulously arranged. James told her during one such meeting, pretending to examine a rose bush. It's small, nothing like this mansion, but... It sounds perfect, Eleanor interrupted, her heart swelling at the thought of a simple home filled with love rather than a grand prison filled with fear. A week before the gala, Eleanor visited her family. She found her mother in the kitchen of their now comfortable home, humming as she prepared dinner with ingredients she no longer had to worry about affording. "Mama," Eleanor said carefully, "do you remember when Grandma used to tell us about her escape from the sharecropping farm? How she said sometimes you have to lose everything to gain yourself." Margaret Peter's hand stilled over the vegetables she was chopping. "Why are you thinking about such old stories, child?" "Because I understand her now," Eleanor said softly. "I understand what it means to sell yourself into a different kind of bondage." Her mother turned, really looking at her daughter for the first time in months. "Eleanor, I'm not happy, Mama. Stephen, he's not who we thought he was. The things he says, the way he treats me, it's killing me inside." Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, her face troubled. "But your sisters, your father's retirement." "We survived before Stephen," Eleanor said, echoing James's words. "We can survive again, and I promise you, I'll help. The right way, through my own work, not through selling myself." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "He'll come after you," she finally said. "Men like that don't let go easily." "I know. That's why I need you to be strong. When it happens, when he comes to threaten and pressure you, remember that I'm doing this for all of us, for our dignity." Margaret. Peter stood and pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. "You're your grandmother's girl, through and through. Go, find your freedom. We'll manage." The night before the gala, Eleanor sat at her desk, penning 2 letters. The first was to Stephen, not an apology, but a declaration of independence. She detailed every slight, every manipulation, every moment of control and cruelty. Let him see himself through her eyes just once. The second letter was to her family. "My dearest family, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please know that this choice, while difficult, is necessary for my survival. Stephen's wealth has been both our blessing and my curse. I cannot continue to live as an ornament, a trophy, a symbol of his progressive thinking while dying inside each day. I have arranged for a trust fund for Marie's education and Sarah's medical care. It's not as much as Stephen provided, but it's honest money, earned through my work and saved carefully. There will be more as I rebuild my life. Remember that our strength has never come from what others gave us, but from what we built ourselves. I'm not running away. I'm running toward the woman I was meant to be. All my love, Eleanor." She sealed both letters, then changed into her nightgown and slipped into bed beside Stephen for the last time. Tomorrow would be the garden gala, and everything would change. The plan was set. James had already sent their essential belongings ahead to California through a series of careful shipments. During the gala, while Stephen was distracted with his social obligations, they would slip away separately and meet at a predetermined location. By the time anyone noticed their absence, they would be halfway across the country. Eleanor knew there would be consequences. Stephen would be furious, humiliated by her public departure. The society papers would buzz with scandal. Her family would face difficult times. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to Stephen's heavy breathing, she felt nothing but peace. Tomorrow, she would attend one final society event as Mrs. Davies. She would smile and nod and play her part one last time. And then, like her grandmother before her, she would choose freedom over comfort, love over security, herself over everything else. As she drifted off to sleep, Eleanor thought of James, of California, of the life waiting to be built. She thought of her grandmother, who had run through darkness to find her light. She thought of all the women throughout history who had broken their chains, chosen their own paths, dared to live on their own terms. "Watch me fly," she whispered to herself, a promise and a prayer in the quiet night. The stage was set. The players were in position. Tomorrow would bring either her greatest triumph or her most spectacular fall. But either way, Eleanor Peter was finally choosing her own path. When trust burns like fire in the night. The morning of the garden gala dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself approved of Eleanor's bid for freedom. She dressed with particular care, choosing a deep blue gown that reminded her of the woman she used to be, elegant but strong, beautiful but unbound. Stephen watched her preparation with unusual intensity. "You seem different today," he observed, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror. "Almost radiant." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, but her voice remained steady. "It's an important day for the Garden Society. I want to make you proud." As they drove to the Whitmore estate, Eleanor's mind raced through the plan one final time. The gala would last until midnight. At 10:30, she would excuse herself to powder her nose. James would create a minor distraction in the garden, nothing suspicious, just enough to draw attention. While everyone was occupied, Eleanor would slip away to their meeting point. The Whitmore mansion was transformed for the occasion. Thousands of roses in every color imaginable decorated the grounds, their perfume heavy in the summer air. Eleanor spotted James among the other workers, putting final touches on the displays. Their eyes met briefly, a world of promise passing between them in that single glance. "Eleanor, darling." Constance Whitmore's voice cut through her thoughts. "Come, you simply must meet our guest speaker. He's a world-renowned expert on heritage roses." The next few hours were a blur of polite conversation and careful pretense. Eleanor played her part perfectly, smiling and nodding at all the right moments. But inside, she was counting down the minutes, feeling the weight of the letters in her evening bag. At 10:25, Eleanor excused herself from a particularly tedious conversation about rose grafting. As she moved toward the house, she heard gasps from the garden. Right on schedule, James had orchestrated his distraction, a small issue with the garden lighting that drew everyone's attention. Eleanor slipped through the quiet house, her heart pounding. Just a few more minutes, and she would be free. She had almost reached the side door when a familiar voice froze her in her tracks. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Davies?" Margaret, her maid-turned-spy, stepped out of the shadows. But she wasn't alone. Stephen stood beside her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" he asked softly, dangerously. "The small withdrawals, the whispered conversations in the garden, your sudden interest in California garden societies?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. "How?" "Margaret has been quite thorough in her reports," Stephen said, nodding to the maid who now avoided Eleanor's eyes. "Though I must admit I had hoped you would come to your senses before it came to this." From outside came the sound of a scuffle, followed by angry voices. Eleanor's heart stopped as she recognized one of them as James's. "Your gardener friend is being dealt with as we speak," Stephen continued, his voice clinical. "Caught stealing valuable heritage roses, I'm afraid. Quite a serious offense in our circles. He'll never work in this industry again." "No," Eleanor whispered, her careful plans crumbling around her. "Please, Stephen, he didn't steal anything. This was my idea." "Of course it was your idea," Stephen cut her off. "You've always had a rebellious streak. It's what attracted me to you initially, though I had hoped marriage would temper it. No matter. We can still salvage this situation." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a piece of paper. "This is a confession, signed by James, admitting to manipulating you, planning to steal both my roses and my wife. Sign this statement, supporting his confession, and I'll ensure he merely loses his job rather than facing criminal charges." Eleanor stared at the paper, her mind racing. Everything had gone so terribly wrong. Through the window, she could see James being led away by security, his dreams of the California garden dying with each step. "What about my family?" she asked, her voice hollow. Stephen's smile was cold. "They can keep everything I've given them. As long as you remember your place and never try anything like this again." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her cage closing in tighter than ever. With trembling hands, she took the pen Stephen offered. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether to James, to herself, or to the dreams they'd shared, she wasn't sure. Later that night, alone in her bedroom, Eleanor pulled out the letter she'd written to her family. With tears falling, she slowly tore it into tiny pieces, watching as the fragments of her hopes scattered like rose petals in the wind. On her vanity lay a new contract from Stephen. Stricter terms, tighter controls, higher walls for her gilded cage. The price of failure was steep indeed, but as Eleanor stared at her reflection, something in her eyes had changed. The fire wasn't extinguished. It had merely gone underground, burning deeper, hotter, more dangerous than before. Stephen might have won this battle, but Eleanor Peter was her grandmother's granddaughter. And like the roses in the garden, sometimes the sweetest blooms grew from pruned branches. She would bide her time, learn from her mistakes, and plan more carefully. Because Eleanor had tasted freedom in those stolen moments with James, had glimpsed the woman she could be, and that knowledge was a seed that would grow despite all efforts to contain it. The question wasn't whether she would try again, it was when. And next time, she would make sure her wings were strong enough to fly beyond any cage, no matter how gilded. The price of freedom comes with wings of gold. 6 months after the failed escape attempt, Eleanor sat in Stephen's study, perfectly poised in her designer dress, watching as he signed papers without looking at her. She had played the role of the repentant wife flawlessly, had accepted her punishment with seeming grace. Every day she wore her submission like a cloak, while underneath she carefully laid the foundations of her real plan. James had left town immediately after that night, his reputation in tatters. But what Stephen didn't know was that Eleanor had managed to slip him a note through Marie before he left. "Wait for me. Some roses take longer to bloom." During these months of apparent submission, Eleanor had been methodically gathering evidence. Every racist comment Stephen made at dinner parties, recorded on her phone. Every threatening email about her family's welfare, carefully archived. Every questionable business transaction she discovered while managing his accounts, documented with precision. She had also been secretly taking online courses to complete her CPA certification, studying late into the night while Stephen thought she was reading society magazines. Her prison had become her classroom, her anger, her motivation. The final piece fell into place when Constance Whitmore's daughter Jessica, after one too many glasses of champagne at a charity event, admitted to Eleanor's sister Marie that she had lied about the school incident. Eleanor had recorded every word. Now, sitting in Stephen's study, watching him sign documents without a care in the world, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. He had no idea that among the papers she'd just handed him to sign was a document transferring a significant portion of his assets into a trust he'd unknowingly established months ago through some creative accounting on Eleanor's part. "Is there anything else, dear?" Stephen asked absently, not even looking up from his papers. "Actually, yes," Eleanor said, her voice steady as she placed a thick envelope on his desk. "Divorce papers." Stephen's head snapped up, his face contorting with rage. "Have you lost your mind?" "No, Stephen, I've finally found it." Eleanor stood, dropping her submissive pose. "Along with those papers, you'll find evidence of every illegal transaction you've made in the past year, every discriminatory hiring practice, every tax evasion scheme. Oh, and proof that you orchestrated false criminal charges against James." Stephen lunged for the envelope, but Eleanor was faster. "Don't bother. Copies have already been sent to the SEC, the FBI, and every major news outlet. I just wanted the pleasure of watching your face when you realized that the silly little black girl you thought you'd bought and paid for just outsmarted you. You wouldn't dare," he snarled. "Your family is already taken care of," Eleanor cut him off. "That trust you just signed. It guarantees their security. And before you try to undo it, remember that any retaliation against me or my family will result in all your other activities becoming very, very public." Stephen's face had gone pale. "You vindictive little—" "Careful," Eleanor warned. "Your words are still being recorded. Now shall we discuss the terms of our divorce like civilized people?" 2 months later, Eleanor stood in a sunlit garden in California. The heritage roses were in full bloom, their perfume filling the air with promise. Behind her a small cottage waited, modest but filled with love and freedom. "The roses look incredible," a familiar voice said. Eleanor turned to find James watching her, his eyes full of pride and love. He had returned to California after receiving her note, trusting her to find her way back to him. Now, as the garden's head botanist, he had created something beautiful, just as she had built her own consulting firm, helping minority-owned businesses navigate their finances. "We look incredible," Eleanor corrected him, reaching for his hand. "All of us." From inside the cottage came the sound of laughter. Eleanor's family was visiting. Marie, home from college where she was thriving, Sarah breathing easily thanks to her continued medical care, their parents finally free to simply love their daughter without the weight of obligation. "Your grandmother would be proud," James said softly, pulling her close. "You didn't just escape, you soared." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the frightened young woman who had once thought she had to sell her soul for her family's security. That woman had grown into someone stronger, someone who had learned that true love strengthened rather than diminished, that real freedom came not from what you were given, but from what you built yourself. "We all bloom in our own time," she said, quoting her grandmother's favorite saying, "Some roses just need a little more sun to show their true colors." As the California sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Eleanor Peter stood in her garden of second chances, surrounded by the love she had chosen and the life she had built. She was no longer a caged bird singing for her supper. She was a woman who had learned to fly on wings of her own making, and in the end, that made all the difference. The society papers had called it the scandal of the year, the young black wife who had outmaneuvered one of Boston's most powerful men. But Eleanor didn't care about their headlines or their whispers. She had written her own story on her own terms, and it was more beautiful than any fairy tale, because sometimes the most precious roses are the ones that grow through concrete, reaching for the sun despite every obstacle. And sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about being rescued, they're about finding the courage to rescue yourself. Eleanor squeezed James's hand, feeling the simple gold band on her finger. Not a shackle this time, but a choice. Above them, a pair of birds soared freely in the endless blue sky, and Eleanor's heart soared with them. She was finally, truly, home.